Abraham Lincoln said, "You can fool all of the people some of the time. Some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time." Good afternoon, my name is MD, and this is the Fourth Branch Project, the first and only program which is strictly dedicated to those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Today, we are going to give you kind of a broad view of what the discussion about the BRET Kavanaugh case has come down to. Now, the latest, as you might have already known, is that it looks like the Republicans are going to take the whole matter to the whole Senate for a confirmation. Yesterday, after a very heated debate between the Republican and the Democrat, especially on the second part of the hearing. The first part was mostly muted because it was conducted by a prosecutor, a female prosecutor brought into the mix by the Republicans, who happened to be an all-male party. So they were afraid to recreate what has happened in 1991 when the Anita Hill hearing occurred, where there was 11 Republican male. 2 decades later, the situation has not changed a bit. So fear of having to go through the same rigmarole, through the same problem, so they made an appeal to a woman, hoping to, at the very least, soften the situation. But before we get there, let's take a quick look at what's been going on in the news. First, as you might already know, that there is currently Mr. Rosenstein, who was supposed to meet with the President of the United States, but unfortunately, the President was too preoccupied to watch the hearing with BRET Kavanaugh and hoping that things would go well, and he wouldn't want to miss a single minute of that. So the meeting was rescheduled rather, for the following week. Now, there is, during the hearing, before we go to the actual tape, there was really some interesting development. Now, it depends on how long you've been following politics. You may know this gentleman, Lindsey Graham, as someone who used to have a brain, who used to be more or less logical, and who used to look at things from the perspective of the country. After all, he served in the military, so he knows the importance of catering to the whole country. But for reasons that are currently seems, well, at the very least for most observers, he had made a 180 degrees turn where he is now cozy up to Donald Trump. Now, it is my view that Lindsey Graham is auditioning for the job of Attorney General. After all, there is no greater pleasure than to show exactly how you're going to fight for the President of the United States, who has been lambasting the current Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, for not having his back. And Lindsey Graham has been going to on the golf course with Donald Trump, and it looks like he has changed his tune from protecting Jeff Sessions to saying that it may come time for Jeff Sessions to just walk away because a president needs someone he can trust. Ironically, Jeff Sessions is probably the first Attorney General who has adopted the principles of the Republican Party in every aspect of the word. So it's not a matter of his job, but rather a matter of preference, because currently Donald Trump is under investigation by the Mueller team and is looking for an attorney to protect him. Ironically, Lindsey Graham, who was quote unquote a good friend of John McCain, which is actually really something to question, because it is rather interesting that before McCain even passed, Lindsey Graham was already making his way to becoming Donald Trump's best friend. And needless to say that yesterday's performance of Lindsey Graham was nothing short of outrageous, and he expressed anger and a temper that simply could only translate to he has finally pleased his boss and secured the job of Attorney General. On another note, you had, of course, Orrin Hatch, who had made a good name for himself, not only since 1991, when he lambasted Anita Hill as the victim of sexual harassment, and today, again, when the Christine Blasey Ford situation came to the surface, the first comment that he made was that Mrs. Ford is a mixed up woman. Needless to tell you, that didn't go well. And also, it is interesting to note that up to this point, Republican Party has not changed a bit 2 decades later. Not a single woman in the judiciary branch to balance the men who don't seem to understand anything about the rest of the population. It is actually a sad situation, considering that the actual demographic of the country has changed drastically, but it doesn't look like those old white men have caught up with the world around them. It is a sad situation. Hopefully, that can be remedied pretty soon. Now, before we get to the interesting part of this conversation today, as I mentioned yesterday, there were 2 sessions. The first part was during which time that Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford came to Congress, rather to the Judiciary Committee, to provide information about the sexual assault scenarios that she had accused BRET Kavanaugh of perpetrating a couple of decades ago. And the second part was occupied by Mr. BRET Kavanaugh, who is currently a judge in the Circuit Court of Appeal in Washington, in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. Now, there was a stark contrast between those 2 people. First, you have Christine Blasey Ford, who was very soft-spoken, never raised her voice, but still managed to convey the information about the sexual assault and came across as a believable individual. And on the second part of the hearing, you had BRET Kavanaugh, who came across as an outraged, mad individual, and by all accounts does not portray the temper of someone to sit on the Supreme Court. As I mentioned earlier, at this point, it looks like the judiciary branch rather the judiciary the Senate committee tasked to vote on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination could not secure enough votes to move the process forward. Jeff Flake, who everybody was looking up to as being the wild card, seems to have proposed a solution to provide FBI the time and the ability to investigate all the accusation before a vote is done. Ironically, that is exactly what all the Democrats have been clamoring, have been asking for. And even Republicans who would want to see Judge Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court think it is a great idea to have the FBI investigate the matter, because no one wants to place an individual on the Supreme Court with clouds of sexual assault over that individual's head. So hopefully the Republican chairman, Chuck Grassley, would see it necessary to heed the advice of his colleague in the Republican Party. Now, here is briefly the first video, or rather the first aspect of what transpired in the hearing yesterday during that aspect of the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. Let's take a look. It looks like we have a short technical problem. We will come back to continue with the conversation. Please don't go anywhere. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. I'll be right back. Ignorance, they say, is the biggest threat to any democracy. Indeed, it is. Plato, a Greek philosopher born in 427 BC, said that ignorance is the root and stem of all evil. Today, members in the Republican Party wear ignorance as a badge of honor, while the rest of the country watch powerless the destruction of a country which was once the envy of the world. The media is the enemy of the country, said Donald Trump. The Democrat legislators are obstructionists for not going along with everything the president wants. The Department of Justice is biased for investigating corruption in the Trump administration. This is the United States of America. Any question?
I'm telling you, Michael Jordan himself was right here in my McDonald's. I fixed him the very first McJordan special.
Right, Bill.
I did. I took a quarter pound of pure beef, smoked bacon, cheese, and some of my favorite barbecue sauce, and I named it the McJordan Special.
Bill, the sandwich, definitely great.
Yeah, but you got to cool it with that story.
But it's true.
How you doing, Bill?
Hi, Michael. Michael.
The McJordans.
Abraham Lincoln said, "You can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time. But you cannot fool all the people all the time." Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the fourth branch program, the first and only program which is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Political partisanship is a very healthy exercise in an environment where true patriotism exists. It can, however, be a force for destruction in an environment where one of the parties, or at least members of one of the parties, practice partisanship without any form of patriotism. Nothing can be as salient as a better example as the hearing that is being placed today in regards to the accusation by Christine Blasey Ford on BRET Kavanaugh, who is the nominee for the Supreme Court Justice. Before the hearing today, there was what can only be described as a country divided starkly in two. On the one hand, you have the Republican who want at all costs to place BRET Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. And on the other hand, you have the Democrats who wouldn't hear of it. Although we are not certain as to whether it is retaliation by the Democrats as far as what has happened to Mary Garland, which was a Supreme Court nominee by the Obama administration, prevented from being placed on the Supreme Court by Mitch McConnell, who withheld a hearing for Mary Garland for at least a year, making it possible for the Trump administration to place a substitute on the Supreme Court to replace Antonin Scalia. Now, whether that's the case or not, it's hard to say, but what's certain is the fact that the line is drawn. Democrat would not budge as far as letting BRET Kavanaugh into the Supreme Court, and Republican would play every possible maneuver to get Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court. 2 weeks ago, it was all but certain that was going to be the case. Number one, Republicans are in the majority, both in the Congress and the Senate. And number two, it seems that they, Republican that is, are not interested in anything, any discussion beyond placing BRET Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Even after Christine Blasey Ford came out as the individual who had accused BRET Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her, Chuck Grassley, who is the chairman for the committee, are currently undergoing this whole charade of hearing, would not do anything to make certain that proper vetting, proper investigation was done, as it is suggested, as it has been all along, that any nominee for the Supreme Court would go through a series of investigation and vetting by the FBI before that individual is even considered for a hearing on the Hill. But this time, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, wants that BRET Kavanaugh would put on the Supreme Court. And the reason that, at least on the surface, that's what it seems like, the Democrats are so much against the nomination of BRET Kavanaugh is because Mr. Kavanaugh is known to have said that a president has plenary power, should not be disturbed, should not be subpoenaed, should not have any disturbance as long as he sits in the Oval Office. But what makes the matters worse is because at this point, Donald Trump is currently under investigation by the special counsel for possible collusion, collaboration with Russian hackers, and quite possibly even with the involvement of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, Republicans, some of them at the very least, have seen and realized that that possibility doesn't exist, but for reasons that are beyond logic, they still want to push BRET Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court. Although one must say that Republicans have a different agenda from the president. Their agenda is purely partisanship, irrespective of the current investigation into the Trump administration, regardless. Be it for the quote-unquote conservative or just to please Donald Trump, the outcome would pretty much be the same, that BRET Kavanaugh would sit on the Supreme Court. And that was certain until 2 weeks ago, when it had become very clear that Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford did not just accuse Mr. Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her a few decades ago, but also is willing to testify to that effect. Now, it must say that Republicans were playing the card that they know if giving Mrs. Ford enough hard time, she would drop the matter altogether. And as it becomes more and more obvious that was not going to be the case, the Republicans change gear, not in terms of canceling the hearing, but rather make it a charade of a hearing. And the reason for the word charade is because never before attempted that a hearing for a nominee of the Supreme Court Justice would be held on the Hill without proper investigation by the FBI. And what makes it even more obvious is the fact that there is precedent. In 1991, there was a similar case. Anita Hill did accuse a Supreme Court nominee, Clarence Thomas, of sexually harassing her. An FBI investigation was conducted, and Anita did testify, and more than 20 witnesses were called in. But this time, Chuck Grassley decides not to call any witness, even including the one, Mark Judge, who Christine Blasey Ford put in the room where she was being assaulted. So it is more than obvious that Republicans did not get to the point of accepting for a hearing to be done with the mindset that if indeed Mr. Kavanaugh is guilty of the accusation, then they would not vote for him, but rather to just have a hearing done in order to appease everybody and please Mrs. Ford for coming forward. But unfortunately, the Republican maneuver seems not working. And the reason for that is because as Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford was awaiting to come to Washington today to testify, two more witnesses came forward and both testified under oath that BRET Kavanaugh did also harass or assault him. And what makes the matter even worse for Mr. Kavanaugh is the fact that one of the individuals involved is able to provide specific details about Mr. Kavanaugh, whereabout, about him being at parties, about being drunk, which contradict an interview that he provided to Fox a couple of days ago, portraying himself as a choir boy, as someone who was never involved in any such activities. Put it bluntly, Mr. Kavanaugh is the worst witness for Mr. Kavanaugh. Would his contradiction come to haunt him? Would his own contradiction serve as the reason for the Republican Congress not to vote fully for him? Would his own contradiction force the President of the United States to withdraw his support for him? This is a matter to follow, as after Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford has testified, immediately thereafter it will be Mr. Kavanaugh's turn. Would it be able to answer all the questions as Mrs. Ford has done? Will he be able to refute Mrs. Ford's allegation without coming across as a white man angry at a white woman who has outed him out? Would he be able to put a picture of himself as someone who has made a mistake in the past, but now has not only been ashamed of those mistakes, but has redeemed himself, and now is fully aware of his weakness, but willing to take the position of the Supreme Court Justice and serve honorably? Those questions and more will need to be answered, and we will have those answers shortly after Mr. Kavanaugh take the hot seat, just as Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford just did earlier in the morning. But above all, despite all that's going on, one thing seems to remain the same. Republicans have drawn a line in the sand. It simply does not matter whether Mr. Kavanaugh did indeed assault Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford. It seems that it doesn't matter that Mr. Kavanaugh did also put his penis on the face of Deborah Ramirez at Yale when they were in college together. And it seems that it doesn't even matter that Mr. Kavanaugh participated in gang rape of women at parties held in Washington, D.C. that were witnessed by Julie Sedgwick, if I said it properly. Does it matter? Would it matter? Well, stay tuned, as we will provide you with further detail about the evolution of the hearing that is still going on, that is still taking place on the Hill. At this point, it is pretty obvious that Mrs. Ford has been very consistent in all her statements. She has been consistent about the letter. She has been consistent about interviews she gave to Washington Post. She has been consistent about talking to congressional members in the Democrat Party. She has been pretty much very consistent all along. At the end of the interview, the prosecutor charged to ask questions seems to be moving into a different direction. This time not to find that Mrs. Ford has lied, but rather to find inconsistencies and to find that maybe, just maybe, the Democrats may have tried to influence Mrs. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony in order to prevent Mr. Kavanaugh from being confirmed. And it seems this is where we're heading at this point, because by all accounts, by any account, Mrs. Ford is obviously nervous, terrified as she put it, but nevertheless truthful. Would Mr. Kavanaugh be the same? Or would he continue doing what he had done during the confirmation hearing process? Not remembering stuff, not answering questions, being evasive? Would it be possible for him to succeed using that strategy? The answer will come very shortly as we continue to watch the hearing and to listen to Mr. Kavanaugh. This is the Fourth Branch program, bringing you an update on the Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh hearing on this day, September 27, 2018. I am MD, and you are on the Fourth Branch program. In 1996, a small network by the name of Fox News was launched with just 17 million viewers. Today, with over 100 million people watching regularly, Fox has become the greatest threat to our democracy, constantly bombarding the airwaves with false information, distortion of facts, and outright lies, presenting to its audience as news. Fox has created an army of blissful ignorance. According to a recent survey, 82% of Fox viewers are ignorant of facts and the truth. To keep millions of people in ignorance not only prevents democracy from flourishing, but it also clears the path to authoritarianism, to dictatorship. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Let me finish by saying that democracy cannot survive in an environment where truth and facts do not matter. At Fox, truth and facts do not matter. Indeed, democracy in America is in jeopardy. It is a crisis the country can no longer ignore. Abraham Lincoln said, "You can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time." Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the fourth branch program, the first and only program which is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Sexual harassment accusation is no small matter. It's not any better for the accused, even if it turns out to be true. Such was the case, for instance, in regards to Bill Cosby. His wife, his family, they all have to endure whatever the outcome is. Whenever the case of sexual harassment or sexual assault is raised, it is very rare for the accuser to admit guilt. In the best of circumstances, the accused would vehemently, adamantly refute the accusation Bill Cosby did. Weinstein, who has been accused by an army of women, has denied each and every one of those accusations. So it goes with sexual harassment in general. So it was not really at all surprising that BRET Kavanaugh, who is chosen to become a justice in the Supreme Court, has also denied the accusation by Christine Blasey Ford. But contrary to Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein, or in fact, or most other accusers of sexual assault, BRET Kavanaugh was accused by one lone individual, notwithstanding, of course, that there were two others who have also come out and claim they were assaulted by BRET as well. This, of course, has caused consternation and even soul-searching. Both Christine Blasey Ford, who had made the accusation, and BRET Kavanaugh, who is at the other end of the accusation, are very successful individuals. Christine is a doctor in psychology and is currently a professor at Palo Alto University in California. She is married with her husband Russell Ford since 2002. They have 2 kids, 2 boys. BRET Kavanaugh is a United States Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. He is married to his wife, Ashley Estate. They have 2 kids, 2 girls. So the accusation of sexual assault by Christine towards BRET could have gone unnoticed, except that it did not. BRET was picked by Donald Trump to become the next Supreme Court justice. According to her report, Christine found the promotion unacceptable because, as she testified earlier, she could not come forward to fulfill her civic duty. Before we move forward, we're going to take a look at a couple of videos in which there are a few details about the testimonies that were given yesterday by both Christine and BRET. Rather than giving you the whole testimony, which lasted quite some time, we're going to provide you the highlight of what transpired during the hearing, both from Christine and from BRET. And we'll come back to discuss a little bit about what it all means. Take a listen.
I am here today not because I want to be. I am terrified. I am here because I believe it is my civic duty to tell you what happened to me while BRET Kavanaugh and I were in high school. I have described the events publicly before. I summarized them in my letter to Ranking Member Feinstein and again in a letter to Chairman Grassley. I understand and appreciate the importance of your hearing from me directly about what happened to me and the impact that it has had on my life and on my family.
I have been a good judge. And for this nomination, another FBI background investigation, another American Bar Association investigation, 31 hours of hearings, 65 senator meetings, 1,200 written questions, more than all previous Supreme Court nominees combined. Throughout that entire time, throughout my 53 years and 7 months on this earth until last week, no one ever accused me of any kind of sexual misconduct. No one, ever. A lifetime of public service and a lifetime of high-profile public service at the highest levels of American government. And never a hint of anything of this kind. And that's because nothing of this kind ever happened.
When I got to the small gathering, people were drinking beer in a small living room, family room type area on the first floor of the house. I drank one beer. BRET and Mark were visibly drunk. Early in the evening, I went up a very narrow set of stairs leading from the living room to a second floor to use the restroom. When I got to the top of the stairs, I was pushed from behind into a bedroom across from the bathroom. I couldn't see who pushed me. BRET and Mark came into the bedroom and locked the door behind them. There was music playing in the bedroom. It was turned up louder by either BRET or Mark once we were in the room. I was pushed onto the bed, and BRET got on top of me. He began running his hands over my body and grinding into me. I yelled, hoping that someone downstairs might hear me, and I tried to get away from him, but his weight was heavy. BRET groped me and tried to take off my clothes. He had a hard time because he was very inebriated and because I was wearing a one-piece bathing suit underneath my clothing. I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. When I did, BRET put his hand over my mouth to stop me from yelling. This is what terrified me the most and has had the most lasting impact on my life. It was hard for me to breathe, and I thought that BRET was accidentally going to kill me.
I was not at the party described by Dr. Ford. This confirmation process has become a national disgrace.
We seem to have encountered another technical problem, but you get the gist of it. We had two very important testimonies. One, the accuser. She's not just anybody, she's a very successful woman, professor at the University of Palo Alto, California. Has a family, 2 boys. BRET KAVANAUGH, also a very successful individual, married 2 girls. Now, by any account, or by all account, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever for Christine Blasey Ford to concoct a story about BRET KAVANAUGh. But at least the way that the second part of the hearing evolves seems to either completely discard Mrs. Ford's accusation or completely agreed with the repudiation of the accusation by BRET KAVANAUGh. Regardless which way you look at it, the Republican in general simply provide what you call a charade of a hearing to appease all parties. Now, there was a lot of conversation on the floor during the second part of the hearing by the Republican accusing the Democrat, starting from Dianne Feinstein, for not having provided the information earlier, and thus considered that as being a strategy or a way to prevent the nomination of BRET KAVANAUGh. In other words, saying that all that which happened is the Democrats' fault. Now, I'm not here to discuss whether the Democrats did that on purpose or not, but what is relevant at this point is the fact that for the first time during the nomination of an individual, that one party decides not to abide by the process, which is to let the FBI conduct a thorough investigation of the nominee and bring the result for the confirmation, for reasons that today are beyond logic. Not quite true, because there is only one reason you would not want FBI to look into what you say, is if you know that you may not be telling the truth, or you expect maybe the friends, especially the individual that Christine placed in the room when she was being assaulted, unless it is believed that that friend would actually tell the story differently from what Mr. Kavanaugh remembered. Now, you can argue that maybe Democrats did that on purpose. You can argue that. That's fine. And there is nothing wrong with arguing that. That's a strategy. That's what you call politics. Now, you may not agree with it, which is fine, but Republican has done the same thing too. Remember Ted Cruz on the Senate floor, filibuster, nonstop? That's politics. Nobody likes it. Nobody agrees with it. But that's part of the tool used by legislators in Washington to prevent something from happening, especially when they are not in the majority. And at this point, the Democrats are in the minority. So, for sake of conversation, let's just assume, I don't know for a fact that that's what they did, but let's just assume for 1 second that's the case. That they decided they're going to hold on to the Christine accusation at the last minute if they were not successful stopping the nomination. Let's say we agree that's exactly what happened. Now, this is not reason enough for Republicans to say we're not going to get FBI involved, because every single nomination that had to go to for a hearing, that had to go for confirmation, has to go through that process. So forget about the fact that Democrats may have done that on purpose. Now, if you look at the time that the Republicans found out that that letter exists, found out that there was an accusation against Brett Kavanaugh, to the time that the hearing happened, 10 days have gone by. And according to experts, it usually doesn't take FBI more than 4 or 5 days to conduct an investigation. So in other words, if Republicans wanted that investigation to happen, at the time that they found out that piece of information, and mind you that from that very moment that Democrats have been asking for an FBI investigation. So this is where I see that maybe, just maybe, I'm speculating here, but it's speculation that seems to be based on some very strong logic, because the only reason that you would not want the agency task to do this kind of job is, well, there are two reasons, two very important reasons. Now remember, we already put aside the fact that we're going to go along with the Republican, that maybe that was a ploy by the Democrat. Maybe they did that on purpose. Whatever the case, let's look at it from a different angle, that between the time that the Republican learned about it to the time the hearing happened, that was yesterday, September the 27th, 10 days have gone by. 10 days have passed. In other words, had the Republican wanted a process based on standard, FBI would have already approached, FBI would have already investigated, and FBI would have already provided a report, because FBI doesn't require 10 days. But Republicans push back every step of the way, even including to the fact that the President of the United States, who has the power to say to FBI, go ahead, do the investigation, even the President himself decided not to let that happen. What that means is two reasons. There are only two reasons, or at least two very important reasons that I can think of. Reason number one is because that investigation was done, report was produced, and the White House has that information and is well aware of the fact that Brett Kavanaugh, everything that Christine Blasey has said, and the other two individuals who have accused Brett Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting or harassing them, White House already has that information, but they suppress that information. They remove it from Brett Kavanaugh's file. That's reason number one. So in which case, if you think about it clearly, if you are going to ask FBI to do something, that would simply mean it wasn't done. And since it was already done in scenario number one, since it was already done, there is no point to asking, because guess what? If you ask FBI again, FBI is gonna just turn around and say, here it is, we already done that, we already gave that to you, here is the copy. And reason number two, Now, even if that investigation, that research was not done before, Brett Kavanaugh had already confessed to those things, about those things, to the White House, or Brett Kavanaugh already has that information and has removed that information from his file and has asked the White House or someone at the White House to remove that information from his file because they're well aware that there are things that would prevent Brett Kavanaugh from being confirmed. So the only way to prevent those information from coming out, that's scenario number 2, is to ask the President of the United States to prevent that from happening. And that, well played, because the only individual who can make that happen to be the President of the United States. And the President is not budging. So those two scenarios tell me that Chuck Grassley and company in the Senate, who are tasked to confirm Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, may have already been hinted at the fact that they don't want an FBI investigation. And we can even go as far as saying that today, remember that after the hearing yesterday, Chuck Grassley, before the hearing even took place, already proposed today, one day after the hearing, to have a vote on the nomination. And sure enough, this morning at 9:30, the whole process started. Now, they were expecting everybody to just fall in line. But there was one aspect of the calculation that they were hoping after all is said and done, then everybody will just fall in line. Jeff Flake happened to be one of the wild card, and he proposed something that has been asked over and over and over, that he would vote for the nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, but with one twist: to get FBI to conduct an investigation. Now, see the problem? 10 days before the hearing, the Republican Judicial Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley learned about the problem. Now, the proper course of action is to have FBI conduct an investigation. Suppress it, didn't do it for whatever the reason is. But again, as I say in my mind, the reason is very simple. They already have that piece of information, or they're already aware that there are things in Brett Kavanaugh's file that would prevent him from being confirmed. So they play every card humanly possible to prevent that from happening. And yet, if you heard them on the floor yesterday, they seem to accuse Democrats of playing tricks to prevent Brett Kavanaugh from being nominated. Now, there is no surprise here. I'm not sure exactly where the surprise comes from, because there was, before those accusations even came forth, the Democrats did rally behind the idea that since Brett Kavanaugh it's quite possible that he would turn the Roe versus Wade against that, then the Democrats were all against Brett Kavanaugh. So there is no surprise here. But Democrats have a big disadvantage, that Republicans have both houses. So the only way out of this predicament, the only way out of this situation, is for them to come with tools that allow them to slow down the process or to even derail it. So this is what we call politics. Dirty, but politics. However, everything that Democrat has done up to this point is within the boundaries of where they are in Washington. They're in the minority. They don't have the leverage, so they use whatever card that they have. But in all fairness, you have to agree also that Republicans could have avoided all that by having the FBI investigation done ahead of time. So there is nothing out of ordinary for the Democrat to ask that an FBI investigation be conducted based on that accusation, because since the beginning of time, that's the way it has always happened. So I'm not even certain why the Republicans were pushing so hard. Even Brett Kavanaugh, who has a stake in the whole matter, could have put the matter to rest by saying, you know what, I know that I'm clean, I know that there is nothing to find, why don't we do the FBI investigation so that we can put the whole matter to rest. Instead, Brett Kavanaugh say over and over and over every time that they ask him, even during an exchange with Dick Durbin, who suggested to him to ask the White House to get on board. He would not do that. So the question is why? What does Brett Kavanaugh have to hide? What does Brett Kavanaugh, what is Brett Kavanaugh afraid of? We know he's afraid of something, because if I were to be in Brett Kavanaugh's shoes and they want an investigation into my background, I would gladly let that happen, because I would not be afraid what FBI would find. So by the same token, if I have something that I know I don't want to come out, the minute they say that, I would do everything humanly possible to prevent that from happening. And because Republicans are in the majority and the White House is occupied by a Republican, so Brett Kavanaugh has secured all the route against any investigation being done. But we know better, because the Democrat, being in the minority, whether they did that on purpose or they played that card on purpose, or they happen to have been lucky to have found that, or at least to have gone by the process that's dictated to Dianne Feinstein at the time that the information was being passed to her. Whatever the case is, it works out on Democrats' behalf. Now, according to the latest report, it looks like Chuck Grassley, who still doesn't want an FBI investigation, is going to bring the matter into the Senate floor next week for a vote, and hoping that there will be enough Republican, or there will be enough time between today, over the weekend, and whenever he brings that into the Senate floor, that there would be enough negotiation done in the background to convince the Republican that they consider as wild cards to get on board. Now, at this point, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever as to why, because think about it. Let's say, for sake of argument, that they go into that vote and it went through. Judge Kavanaugh become the next Supreme Court justice. And let's also say that Democrat wins the House, even if it's just Congress. Then they will have the power to go after Brett Kavanaugh, or at the very least, investigate the accusation against Brett Kavanaugh. And if found to be true, then Brett Kavanaugh will be impeached. Why would Republicans want to go through that process? It doesn't make any sense. So it is my view, and it is logical, that Republican either already has the information, the White House already has the information, the Republican, at least the leaders in the Judicial Committee, Chuck Grassley and probably his assistant, his deputy, people who are close to him in his close circle, they already have the information that Brett Kavanaugh has that accusation or those accusations in his record, and they know that the White House has that information, or they're aware that Brett Kavanaugh removed those information from his file, so they know that an FBI investigation will find those information again, because the first place that they look into is probably their house. Those information will be into their will already be present into their system. So once those information come out, it will do two damages to Brett Kavanaugh, not just one, two. Number one, it will not be confirmed to the Supreme Court, and number two, he may even lose the post that he currently has. And my suspicion is that's the problem. They are well aware that Brett Kavanaugh has those 10 in his record. Brett Kavanaugh is aware of it. Brett Kavanaugh is not a choir boy. He has lied. As a matter of fact, even before this accusation came forth, you watched Brett Kavanaugh during the confirmation hearing, unless you were to be completely deaf. And I would venture to say even a deaf person would be able to figure out that Brett Kavanaugh was lying every step of the way. So now the accusation comes. He had plenty of practice. He lied some more. So it is my view that Brett Kavanaugh, the White House, leaders in the Judicial Committee, Republican Judicial Committee, already have the damaging information about Brett Kavanaugh. And if not, Brett Kavanaugh himself already have those information removed from his record, and he may have passed that information to someone. So now they're playing everything possible to prevent an investigation from being done. That is the reason that Republicans, no matter, they would prefer, or they would opt, they would prefer two things to happen instead of letting an FBI investigation happen. Go onto the floor to have a full vote and let Brett Kavanaugh not pass, or Brett Kavanaugh remove his nomination and let this whole thing die that way. And my suspicion is, if I had to bet, I would say the following. Before, and mark my word, before this is get into the Senate floor for a full vote, one or two things are going to happen. Brett Kavanaugh is going to withdraw his nomination. The White House is going to withdraw his support, or the Republican Party are going to say they're not going to go forward with the vote to have the FBI start an investigation. In other words, bye-bye Brett Kavanaugh. So either one of those three options will be taken before this thing come to a vote, because it is fairly certain that Brett Kavanaugh is aware that Christine Blasey Ford is telling the truth. Brett Kavanaugh is also well aware that Julie State Whip is telling the truth. So Brett Kavanaugh knows that the jig is up. There is no way out. There is nowhere to run. This is it. I'll be right back. I do thank you for watching. I hope you have a great afternoon, and I hope to see you again next time. This is the 4th Branch program, the first and only program which is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Good day.
I'm telling you, Michael Jordan himself was right here in my McDonald's. I fixed him the very first McJordan special.
Right, Bill.
I did. I took a quarter pound of pure beef, smoked bacon, cheese, and some of my favorite barbecue sauce, and I named it the McJordan special.
Bill, the sandwich definitely great.
Yeah, but you got the cooling with that story.
But it's true.
How you doing, Bill?
Hi, Michael. Michael.
The McJordan